Hey there, this is the podcast making sense of health news with candid conversation and curiosity. Because when we know what's schmelthy, that's when we can start getting healthy. And welcome to Healthy Schmelthy. Thank you very much for joining me. And who am I, you're probably asking? Well, that's a fantastic question. I'm glad you asked it. I'm a career healthcare information specialist. Not only that, I'm also a master's of public health.
All the way from Ann Arbor, give it up for my homeboy, Rishi B!
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. Please hold your applause. Please. I insist. Please, folks, sit down, please. No, I insist. You? Hey, you. Yeah, I'm looking at you. I insist you sit down. Please stop applauding. Okay. All right. I think we're good. But thank you very much for joining me on this episode where I'm going to share a conversation that I had with Neil Patel, aka Headphones Neil. Headphones Neil does a YouTube series, which is what prompted me to ask him to join me on Healthy Schmelthy. His YouTube series, he calls it the Moment of Zen. So what he does is he has some videos that are very calm and very peaceful. And I'll be talking to him about what inspired that and what kind of things he's learned from doing that in his own life that he can kind of share with the rest of us about how we can all find Zen. It's very helpful. And what he ends up talking about is there may be small actions that we can all take up front where we can think about what are the things that make us happy. And maybe by doing that, that will lead us to have big relief in the end. Small steps leads to big relief. It's a great conversation. That's coming up in just a bit. But first, we got to know what's going on in health news. And in order to do so, I need someone to please bang a gong. So here we go. Bang a gong. Let's get it on. It's time for health headlines. Thank you for ringing that gong. Before we get into the headlines, I just wanted to share something about the pandemic. And just in talking with friends and family, a lot of people are asking themselves, including myself, I'm asking these as well, am I doing enough to stay safe? Well, what symptoms do I need to be looking out for? Those are some valid questions, and unfortunately, I think what we're finding as more and more evidence is collected about COVID, which of course is a brand new disease, unfortunately, science and social media, the immediacy that's demanded by social media, do not quite jive together well. Science needs to mull things over to figure out if observations are factual or not. And, social media moves a lot faster than that. So I put together some links that I find helpful just in normal times. Some links from resources that I find helpful from, for example, the CDC and the Johns Hopkins Coronavirus Research Center. Some links to help you feel engaged and feel in control about what you're finding out about the disease and how you can stay safe. I have that in my website under the menu of COVID-19 help. You can get there at rishibi.com. And hopefully that gives you a little sense of being in control and knowing what's going on as this pandemic looms over our heads. But let's get on to that first story. First story, AHA lawsuit on price transparency is overruled. What this means for consumers. So that's the title of a Forbes article talking about a recent federal court decision that led hospitals to have to post prices of services in a consumer-friendly format by this coming January. And this video by an organization, Thrive, explains the lawsuit.
On November 15th, the Trump administration released 2 regulations aimed at increasing price transparency for patients and are intended to allow them to make more informed decisions when making healthcare choices. The first is focused on hospital price transparency and builds on the January 1st, 2019 regulation requiring hospitals to post their CDM list prices to the internet in a machine-readable format. Effective January 2021, hospitals will now be required to post their payer-negotiated rates for all payers and the discounted cash price in the CDM on their website. In addition, they will be required to post gross charge and reimbursement rate information for 300 services that patients frequently shop for, known as shoppable services, and display this information in a consumer-friendly format.
Okay, so that once again was a video by a group, and Thrive, explaining the nature of a lawsuit that was just dismissed by a federal court, which means hospitals now have to post the prices of their top 300 services in a easily consumable format for consumers. So I'm going to share at the website rishibi.com, the show notes for this episode, a Forbes article that argues that this is a win for consumers. However, there is some debate over how really effective this is for consumers overall. So that article will get into some of that and give you some of that information. I personally, I think that this is a good step for helping consumers kind of figure out hospital prices and kind of get their hands around the prices and their bills, the medical bills. I know this personally. My wife was just on the phone for 4 hours between a clinic and her health insurance. She was trying to figure out what the price would be for a service. And she was on the phone between the two for 4 hours, ultimately just to be told that it's proprietary information and they couldn't help her. So that's a better story than getting a surprise medical bill. But still, I do think that some more work needs to be done for helping consumers get their hands around hospital pricing. And this is probably one good step towards that direction. Let's move on to the next story. Immunity to the coronavirus is fragile and short-lived. Immunologist warns. Holy cow, that is a complicated word. Immunologist. Holy cow, I still can't do it, and I'm doing it slower. Anyways, moral of the story, immunity to the coronavirus is fragile and short-lived. That is the title, a hard-to-say title, of an article by CNBC. Let's take a listen to this video.
So immunology of this infection has moved forwards in leaps and bounds, and I've been astounded by the progress since we first got the virus sequence in January the 11th. We know more about immunity to this virus than about many other pathogens on Earth. So I think the effort has been astounding, and there's been payoff in terms of fine-tuning of treatment and fewer people dying. So in some senses, I think it's gone well. If you're asking me where do we stand on the herd immunity idea, we are where we are. It was probably never going to work. Most of the urban centres where we've had infection are probably at about 10 or 15% of the population immune. And immunity to this thing looks rather fragile. It looks like some people might have antibodies for a few months and then they might wane. So it's not looking like a safe bet.
So immunity is short-lived. What does that mean for us? What does that mean for the rest of us? Well, what that means is that our bodies are not going to build immunity or antibodies after getting infected with COVID to the rate that that experts first thought. And this was concluded by a large study done in Spain with 60,000 people. And so this seems pretty scientifically accurate. So what now then? Well, what that means is that herd immunity, and you may have heard that Sweden was trying this out, a herd immunity tactic where kind of let the virus live and let the people kind of live mostly as normal and let the disease run its course and don't prevent the economy from running so much. Well, unfortunately, that tactic didn't quite work out, and this is why. Is unfortunately COVID patients, they don't build antibodies to the rate that would be necessary for herd immunity to be developed that way. So the only way to get it is we need a vaccine that can stimulate the antibody response from our immune systems. And many experts are still pretty optimistic for getting a vaccine by the end of the year. You can get more information about that from one of the links that I have in my website under COVID-19 help. That's from WebMD, and they kind of keep track of what's the status of all the vaccines. So there's 170 vaccine candidates out there in the world, by the way. So you can get more information about that. This is a pretty interesting story if you're interested in how herd immunity is going to work. Highly recommend getting this article from CNBC. But let's move on to the last story. It's not too late to avoid the dire picture Dr. Fauci outlined in congressional testimony of 100,000 coronavirus cases a day. So this is an article from NPR. It's an article, and this article also shares a interview that NPR did with Dr. Anthony Fauci, who is the head of America's response to COVID-19. And he's also the director of National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. He's done that since 1984. And what this article is about is in response to a comment that Dr. Fauci made in a recent congressional recent congressional testimony, where he warned that if the country didn't take the pandemic more seriously and they didn't take restrictions more seriously, then we're going to go from where we are right now, which is 50,000 new American COVID cases a day, to 100,000 cases a day. This is Dr. Fauci elaborating in this interview.
Allow me to sharpen that question. Can we turn this around? Can we turn these numbers around without an even more aggressive shutdown than we had in March and in April?
I believe the answer is yes, but we have to do things a bit differently than what we've been doing. Because when you talk about the goal of everyone to try and proceed towards normalization by taking steps in the Opening America Again program, which were guidelines that had good and well demarcated benchmarks. What we saw, and it really varied from state to state, were people out there congregating in bars, congregating in crowds in a celebratory way, understandably, because they felt cooped up, without wearing masks. That is, in many respects, if I might use the word, it's a violation of the principles of what we're trying to do. And that is the social distancing, the wearing of masks. So it's really in our hands as a community, as a nation, as a populace to make this happen. It does not have to be 100,000 cases a day. I use that number because I wanted to jolt people into realizing.
Yeah, you got our attention.
No, we did. And that's exactly what I wanted to do, because as I've said so many times over the previous weeks to months, if you leave the virus to its own devices, it will take off on you. The control of an outbreak is what we do to oppose the dynamics of the outbreak.
Okay, so once again, that was Dr. Anthony Fauci talking about a recent comment that he made about how cases in America could shoot up to 100,000 a day. So later on in this interview, Dr. Fauci addresses some questions about how there's been mixed messaging about COVID, in particular, what we should be doing to fight the pandemic. And, I think it's pretty good. So I highly recommend listening to the full interview at rishibi.com or finding it on NPR. But one thing that he talks about, and I think this kind of gets to the heart of a problem, that social media doesn't really jive well with science. I think that's become pretty clear in pandemic. And one of those areas where we're seeing that is face masks. So actually earlier in the year, early in the pandemic, the Surgeon General tweeted that face masks are useless. That was a direct quote. And Fauci himself, in that NPR interview, regrets the way that he himself communicated about face masks. And the WHO also recently, a couple weeks ago, they put out something about masks not really being all that effective. And then they later retracted that message. So a lot of mixed messaging. And unfortunately, we're having to wait some time before things get solidified into actual guidelines. For example, we're seeing that there's some time before the pandemic started, and then therapeutics came out, some drugs that we could use to fight the pandemic. And so in that wait time, President Trump, kind of casting on and using the hopes that we had to fight the disease, he kind of overhyped some messaging about the hydroxychloroquine drug and also UV light. This whole thing about science and social media is really getting to us, I think. And I think what Dr. Fauci is getting at is it's our responsibility to act like we're carrying the disease. That's why I thought it was good to see Republican leadership promoting face masks. Recently, publicly, Mitch McConnell and Vice President Mike Pence, they were promoting and wearing face masks. And, I think that's good because, a lot of us can use that design, face masks covering our faces. There's a lot of potential there. You can get some designer face masks to make yourself look cool. You can get a Detroit Tigers if you're in the Detroit area to make yourself like the Tigers, even though the Tigers probably were hoping that the baseball season would just get canceled this year. Maybe you'll even find that wearing a mask, just in general, improves your look, like Howard Stern did in this conversation that he had with Charlize Theron.
It's a shame that I have to wear a mask. And I saw pictures of you in the paper in a mask, and I went, God, why cover that face? Everyone else, I thank God there are masks now. And I don't know why people are uptight about it. If you look like me, I look better in a mask than I've ever looked. I look 20 years younger. Covers my neck, everything.
Way to think outside the box, Howard Stern. You'll find links to all the articles and videos that was discussed in the health headlines in this episode at rishibi.com. And once again, links that I find helpful to stay informed during pandemic are also at the COVID-19 help section at rishibi.com. But that's the news. More Healthy Schmelthy in just a moment. Okay, once again, the show notes for this episode are at rishibi.com, where you can also engage with me and send me some comments. Are you struggling with keeping up during this whole pandemic? Do you think your neighbors are doing enough? Feel free to vent at me at my email, therishibi@gmail.com, or vent at me. You can find me on Twitter, that's just rishibi, or post a comment on the Healthy Schmelthy Facebook page where I share regular health updates. And appreciate your subscribing and leaving a positive iTunes review for this podcast. You can find the podcast at all the major podcatchers, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Play. It's everywhere. It's everywhere that you find podcasts. So appreciate your engagement with the show. And later on in this episode, I'll be sharing a clip of good news from a past episode with tips on losing your quarantine 15 and finding fitness during pandemic. That's coming on later in this episode. But right now, let's get into my conversation with Neil Patel, aka Headphones Neil. We're going to be talking about finding Zen in the middle of a pandemic. He's going to share some tips on how you can find Zen and how, specifically, how you can filter out noise from your social media to just the things that make you happy. That's just an example, and there's much, much more. Let's get into my conversation with Neil Patel. Okay, and talking about Zen is none other than Neil Patel, aka Headphones Neil. Thank you very much, Neil, for joining me.
Thanks for having me, Rishi. How are you doing?
Yeah, doing all right. And I have you on for a special topic. I think it's very special for this pandemic situation the entire world finds itself in. And so we became to know each other through being fans of the same podcast, The Morning Stream, and the Frog Pants community. And we've been talking a little bit about talking with each other for a podcast. And all of a sudden what do I see but none other? And so now I'm finding myself shut down in my walls through this whole quarantine process, lockdown. And what could help more when you're in this situation than finding something peaceful? And so, Neil, I want you to tell me a little bit about something that you're doing through your YouTube channel and through your social media, because I see that you've been posting numerous videos that you call Moment of Zen. Can you tell the folks about what that is?
Yeah, so about mid-March, probably right about the same time as a lot of people, I started working from home and spending about 9 hours a day within four walls got to be kind of mind-numbing, boring, dull. So I started going for hikes, wearing my mask and gloves and all that on a day-by-day basis. And as I usually do when I'm on a walk or a hike, is I'll take a picture of something that stands out, whether it's nature, flowers, and things like that. And then I got to taking videos, because at some point I forget if the first one was of this family of ducks or just nature outside, but I realized that nature was making me feel calmer and calmer with cleaner air, cleaner skies. So I started doing 1-minute videos, just what I call moments of Zen, because I equate a minute to about a moment. So it'd be flowers or grass or nature, this family of ducks wandering around a lake, eating and spending time with their family, and sharing it to YouTube, because I figured there's a lot of people around the country, around the world, that are in the same position, same boat as me. So figured share a moment of Zen. What's making me happy might make other people feel happier, more Zen-like, more peaceful and happy, and just take a moment out of their day to find some happiness, to relax a little bit and make it through that day and into the next one.
That's great, Neil. So this is actually inspired from this whole pandemic situation and everyone being shut inside.
Yep. And then as a bit of personal progression, it also gives me a way to practice taking pictures and taking videos and improving how I do that as well, to hopefully take better pictures and videos than before. Not always successful, but just as a way to say, okay, well, I like this picture. Did it do better than the last one? Well, okay, yes, it's different, or the quality is better, or I've zoomed in a little bit more and I've found a different shot of something in nature that is pretty beautiful, relaxing, and back to the topic of Zen.
Sure. Yeah. So it's actually through this, I don't know if you want to call it a hobby or a faint interest of photography and that kind of thing. That's kind of where you find Zen?
Yeah. So I would pretty much call it amateur photography. So since about 2011 or 2012, I've owned a smartphone. So I've noticed over time how camera lenses on smartphones have gotten better and better, and camera apps have gotten better and better. So just for a personal point of knowledge and education, I've learned how to take pictures, how to focus shots, learned the idea behind ISO and focus and all of that. Not always remembering what everything means and when it's the best time to use it, but basically to learn that, okay, exposures matter, framing your shot matters, and taking the time to take a good shot definitely helps in having a good picture, whether or not it comes out as focused as you would want, but at the very least, having the picture of what I want in frame and in focus enough to make it enjoyable and have it stand out. So when other people look at it, they can figure it out on their own with little input from me and enjoy it to the extent that they can enjoy it, but then also learn how to take those better pictures than before. So over time I can see and say that, okay, back in 2012 I took this picture and at the time it looked good, but now I can honestly say that it's not really that good looking. The resolution is there, but taking a picture of that same flower in 1 year or 1 day versus another, I can see that progression over time. So I can see that improvement in myself, that I've done a better job than before, and something has stuck, something I've learned, or I've learned something over that time to make sure that that picture is better than before.
Oh, that's really cool that you're trying to improve a number of different things by finding Zen, not just your own mental status, but also your ability to capture Zen. And I have to compliment you now that I know that that's something that you're actively trying to do, because I can, for the life of me, not keep a camera kind of held tightly while I'm like following something with like tracking with video. And you followed that family of ducks. That was the first moment of Zen that kind of I picked up on. And you were following that very tightly. So I have to compliment you on your skills that you have thus far.
Yep, and that's actually the hardest part for me, is doing that tracking, but then also keeping a steady arm while doing it. So I know camera technology has improved where now we have optical image stabilization, so phones can do that on the fly better and better each year. But I know for me, it's hard to keep track of, okay, I want to keep my arms going as straight as possible. But after maybe about 30 or 40 seconds, I can feel my arms getting tired. My muscles are starting to cramp up a little bit from staying that steady. So it's one of those things where a tripod definitely would come in handy, which I always somehow manage to forget to carry with me. Even though I'm like, all right, so today I'll think about, at lunchtime, like, all right, I'm going to take my tripod today. And then, of course, by the time I go for my walk, I've forgotten all about it and I've left and I'm about halfway done with my walk. But
Right. And so you mentioned that this specific Moment of Zen video idea came to you kind of recently because of the pandemic, but have you always kind of been interested in finding peace or that kind of thing? Maybe not necessarily calling it Moment of Zen, but just kind of finding peace in general. Has that always been important to you?
Yeah, so I've always found myself to be a generally quiet and happy person. So I found that exercising at the end of the day always makes me feel better. Going for a walk or going out and about generally helps in relieving stress. So whether it's stress from the day, stress from a particular phone call, or maybe I got chewed out or I had to chew somebody out for something that happened. So I'm always, in the back of my mind, I always have wanted to have that thing, whether it's working out, photography, playing a video game, watching TV. So, for example, my favorite show in the evenings to watch is The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. So it's become, for me, less about the politics of the show and just the humor of something he's found. So I've enjoyed his ray of sunshine, or ray of light at the beginning of the show that they've been doing, where they find extra funny topics or just things to make people happy. And it's like, all right, that was kind of silly, that was kind of stupid, but it did make me smile, it did make me laugh a little bit. And it's made my parents also find a little bit of humor and happiness at the end of their day. Granted, they're retired, so it's not that hard to be relaxed and happy throughout the day. But it's just nice that, exactly. So it just makes it nice to see them smile and laugh out of the silliness or stupidity of it, and just to see that something's made them laugh as well at the end of the day, especially since I'm up in my room working for 8 hours a day, so I don't really get to see them outside of them doing their usual daily routines.
Right. So you gave a number of different tips there, maybe finding something, a show or some kind of cultural thing that you can kind of wash the politics out of. Actually, I have to recommend that as well. I try to kind of take things, even if they're talking about politics, I try to kind of wash down the politics out of it and just try to enjoy the thing for what it is. Because I find myself getting stressed out thinking about politics at all. Even now, saying the word politics 3 or 4 times, the hair on my neck is starting to stand up. Yeah. But I was kind of curious if someone listening to this who, isn't very great at photography or something like that. Is there any kind of go-to thing you might recommend to them to help them kind of find some peace?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm technology minded, so things like learning about the latest new cell phone specs and hardware and things like that make me happy as well. So one of the other things I know for me is I'm on social media enough throughout the day. So Facebook and Twitter. One of the things I did was I found myself between Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram feeling a little overwhelmed with all the content that was going on. And so I want to say, I forget when I shut down my Instagram, but the initial point is I did shut down my Instagram because I found that between the 3 social networks, I was duplicating and triplicating a lot of the content that I was looking at. So I was finding that a lot of time I was spending on, whether it was on my phone or on the laptop, was looking at the same content over and over. So it's kind of mental fatigue in looking at the same content over and over. So I shut down my Instagram page, and then I figured out a way for myself to simplify where I was looking at content. So for Facebook, I've narrowed it down. I've unfollowed a lot of pages, but I've kept it limited to friends that I'm with or my friends on Facebook, and then also a few groups. So one of the groups for the morning stream, affectionately called the Tadpool, a politics group, a photography group. So a lot of the groups that stem from the morning stream, I still follow because they're well enough sandboxed apart from each other. So when I'm looking in that group, I know exactly, or mentally, I know exactly what I'm in for. Some of that content I do see still on Twitter, for example, but when I'm on Twitter, I know I'm looking at specific content, whether it's a creator who's come up with a new piece of artwork or something funny or something newsworthy that's going on. So it's a lot more breaking news content that I can follow there versus people sharing their opinions and views on Facebook in the various groups, or whether it's some friends sharing stuff that they're up to. And then I've kind of converted Twitter into my place to go to for photography, but also limiting it to communities on XDA developers, which is a site for tech enthusiasts for smartphones, and then also the OnePlus community app, which is the manufacturer of my cell phone, and more guided tips for the smartphone that I'm using. So it's kind of creating that focus of where I'm getting my content across different social media. And then, of course, having notifications in Google News and the Google app. So I get articles that way and stories that way of what's going on if it kind of falls through the crack of not showing up on Facebook or Twitter. So
that's really smart. So you've kind of put some forethought into, well, I'm going to be on my phone for these reasons. I'm going to access these apps, but maybe I can change why I access those apps and kind of have a reason for why I'm accessing each one, instead of just kind of being overwhelmed by all the content that's on there if you don't put that forethought into it. That's actually a really interesting idea.
Right, exactly. Because I know for me, for a number of years, if someone said, hey, you need to follow this person here or follow that person there, I'd be like, yeah, sure, there's a reason for it. I know that person, I trust them. So I would just do it. Now all of a sudden, like going through Facebook, unsubscribing to stuff, turning stuff off, removing access to different apps I've used over the years. It took me a really long time to undo a lot of that stuff. But I do realize that I am using all those different sites and services a lot less, but getting the same quality and amount of feedback and input that I was getting from before.
That's a really cool idea. That's a great recommendation. I love that. My quick recommendation that I'm going to share that I find helpful for me is while Neil is out there taking a walk during his lunch break, on my lunch breaks, I'll take a small little cat nap, and I kind of meditate, not really sleep, but it's more like taking a couple minutes to meditate. So in case anyone else out there has thought about meditation, I read this somewhere. I forget where. I wish I could cite where I found this. It might have been Time Magazine, but a really cool way to meditate is you kind of think of your head as you close your eyes, and you break off your head into 4 quadrants, and you do deep breathing. And when you exhale twice into each quadrant, and you kind of do that as a cycle. And as you're deep breathing and thinking about your head, you'll kind of find yourself drifting away. And so for me, I just do this for about maybe just about 7 to 10 minutes, and I find myself refreshed afterwards. And actually, I did this one time, and a colleague of mine, after I had done that, complimented me. They didn't even know that I do this. They complimented me for looking refreshed after I did that. Yeah, so that was kind of a random thing.
Now, do you use a timer or something to keep track of those 7 to 10 minutes, or do you just have a mental idea of like, okay, I'm feeling a lot better, so I'm going to stop now, and it happens to be that time frame?
No, for me, I actually find it more soothing and find myself able to drift away if I know that there's a timer that's going to wake me up. So I do set a timer, Yeah. And a lot of times now I kind of find myself getting refreshed before the timer goes off. But,
Yeah, there you go.
hey, whatever works for you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I've tried to avoid taking naps at lunch just because of one story that could have turned out poorly, but actually turned out okay. Was a couple jobs a couple jobs after I graduated college.
Mm-hmm.
It was a particularly long morning. I hadn't slept well the prior night, so like, all right, well, I have an hour-long lunch. The company's buying less lunch that day, so I'll take a nap during my lunch break. I set an alarm, which I didn't for about 10 minutes prior to my hour being over. I didn't hear, so I overslept by about 15 or 20 minutes. My boss comes outside, knocks on my window, and says, "So Neil, are you going to come back to work at some point?" And I'm like, "Wait, of course I am. I had my alarm set. My alarm was still going off." And she's like, "Well, your alarm's going off, so I thought maybe you're ignoring it and you don't want to come back." I'm like, "Oh no, I'm sorry. I apologize profusely." And I was like, "Oh well, great. Now I'm going to get written up, and there goes my job." But she's like, "Well, did you do that on purpose?" I'm like, "Nope. I honestly fell asleep. I didn't sleep well last night. Didn't hear my alarm, and I'll make it up. I'll stay extra at the end of today, or I'll shorten my lunch tomorrow. Whatever I need to do to make it up." I honestly did oversleep. I didn't hear my alarm. I slept through it, and so she's like, "Nope. Just stay extra during the end of the day. Make it up. We'll worry about the overtime and all that later. I heard your alarm going off, and I saw you sleeping, so I know that you weren't actively trying to not come back to work. So just to make sure it doesn't happen again." So since then, I've been paranoid about sleeping during my lunch hour.
Sure. Yeah.
So it turned out well. I was relieved, but it was also like, oh, great. Well, now if I do that anywhere else, I don't think it's going to end as well as it did in that sort of situation.
That's a good point. I am a very light sleeper, so this does kind of work out for me. And I'm very good at short naps that I find benefit from. So I do have those on my Dungeons and Dragons character profile of being Rishi.
Hey, there you go. Yeah, there's days I wish I was a light sleeper, and there's days that I wish I was a heavy sleeper. So
yes.
I always have to make sure I have my couple of alarms to wake me up every day.
Okay, so that was a great recommendation from Neil. Maybe you can help kind of pick and choose how you sample the world and sample all this social media that's on your fingertips. Maybe you can help yourself by putting some thought into that. I love that recommendation, Neil. That was really great.
Yeah, for sure, you got.
Yeah, and so rounding things off, I guess, are there any last minute thoughts you have about any recommendations or anything like that for helping people find Zen?
Not particularly, but I will say that for a simple photography tip, so everyone has, or not everyone, but a lot of people have smartphones in their pockets these days, whether it's a cell phone connection or just iPod Touch.
I think it's the one thing of America, actually.
Exactly. So the one thing that I try to recommend or two things I recommend are, most smartphones these days have option to turn on a grid in your viewfinder. So when you're taking a picture, I find that having that viewfinder turned on helps me center my picture. So if I want the ducks to be in the center of my picture, or a flower, or a cloud, or just I want to center my picture a little bit, I'll make sure I have that grid turned on so that I can center my shot that much easily. I find that my pictures have turned out to be a lot more to my liking since I've done that, because I used to eyeball it, and then the pictures would be off center a little bit, or they'd be off to the side and not quite where I wanted them. But having that grid turned on has made my pictures feel a little bit more professional to me, or amateurly professional, if that makes sense.
Sure, yeah.
And then the other option is to turn on your HDR mode. With that, you take a higher quality pictures. You get a little bit more color range, color depth. So pictures just turn out a little bit more sharper, so that they look that much more pleasing to the eye, and you get a little bit more detail when you zoom into your picture.
Is that within the camera app, or would that be a setting on the phone? HDR mode?
So usually it's within the camera app itself. So depending on the app, you might have to swipe between some text at the bottom of your screen. You might see a little HDR button at the top of your screen, or you'll have to go into the settings of your app. Unfortunately, to say, As much as I don't like saying it, probably iPhones make it a little bit easier to do that. I don't have an iPhone myself, so I can't say where it is currently.
Sure.
On Android, that's kind of where the confusion comes in as to where it's at. So in the Google Camera app, I believe it's touching the little arrow at the top of the screen will bring a menu up where you can enable the HDR toggle. On other Android phones, you have it at the bottom with a row of text. So you have, nightscape or night sight, photo, macro mode. So it can be in a number of different places, but poking around, it'll usually stand out as HD mode or HDR mode.
Yeah.
Or enable high dynamic range.
Neil, I don't mean to put a lot of pressure on you, but you might have just saved my marriage, because my wife is always complaining about how my phone, Pixel 2, takes bad photos, and I may have not had that HDR mode on.
There you go. So, and as a bit of sharing, there is a website that is all about the Google Camera port. So a group of developers have enabled Google Camera for non-Pixel phones. So if you are an Android user and you find that your camera app is lackluster, or you find that it's not taking as good of quality pictures as you want, this particular website has model or different versions of the app based on your Android versions. So you can take those higher quality pictures and not have to worry if the setting is on or off, or is my picture going to be as good or bad quality. So I can definitely help you out with that, to turn on that setting and maybe even find a newer version of the app to take even better pictures.
That is perfect, Neil. You just saved my marriage single-handedly. Neil Patel of California.
And that has made my day and made it that much better.
Thank you, Neil. Headphones, Neil. Okay, so rounding things off, let's get into what you got going on, plugs-wise. I'm going to ask you to let the folks know what you got going on and what your plugs are, but I also want to ask you to answer a silly question. So if I know that you watch Westworld, that's how our relationship started, is talking a little bit about Westworld. If you could pick, so let's say you're living in the Westworld universe. If you could pick a Westworld park to live in, which one would you be in? Would you be, these are the parks that have been revealed thus far in the show. Would you be in the Westworld park? Would you be in the kind of traditional Japanese style one, which they call Shogun World? Or would you be in the Raj, which replicates when Brits owned India from 1858 to 1947?
So my default setting is I want to be in the Westworld park, the Westworld Prime Park, just because I am a fan of the Old West. I kind of like that environment, the setting, and all of that. Sure. But I do want to see more of the Raj. I kind of feel that I didn't see enough of that. I believe we only saw it in the first season, if memory serves.
I think it's the first,
or maybe second. Yeah, so we only saw a brief glimpse of it, but it did leave me wanting more. So I am kind of curious to see more of that, and would be willing to spend more time in that park as well. So it's a very close second.
Okay. Yeah, I kind of have the same split. I'm kind of a pansy, so I don't think I would last very long in Westworld. I'm much better being a subservient Indian to the Brits in the Raj.
Yeah, I'd probably be like the saloon owner or the bartender in the saloon, or maybe the hotel owner, or some character like that, where I'm like an NPC on the side, kind of.
Exactly. Yeah. I don't want to bother you.
I'd probably be the worst gunslinger in Westworld. So, the bartender or the hotel owner or someone like that. And I guess the hotel owner kind of makes sense, being an Indian myself. But kind of where I fit in the most.
Hey, who put this Ramada in the Wild Wild West?
Yeah, exactly. But it's one of those things where it's like, that's kind of where I fit in, and I probably last the longest as well.
Okay, you can have the Ramada Inn in the Wild West. I'm gonna have the 7-Eleven on the corner.
Hey, there you go. 7-Eleven saloon, close enough, right?
Oh, hey, yeah, there you go. And what do you got going on, Neil? Headphones, Neil. What are some of the shows that you got going on?
Sure. I'm on Twitter at PatelN01, and the website is pateln01.com. Content is shared to both places pretty regularly, so as soon as something goes on the website, I'll usually share it to Twitter within maybe about an hour or so, unless I get totally sidetracked.
Okay. And you have a Android show, is that correct?
Yep. So the podcast that I host is a recap of stuff that I'm watching during the week, and then apps and games that I'm playing on my Android smartphone. So I do video screencasts of that as well. So not only do you get to hear me talking about what I'm doing on my phone, but you can also watch along at the same time.
Oh, nice. Cool. I'll have to check that out. I am an Android user. I'm one of the. It feels like there's dozens of us out there in America.
Yeah,
Everyone
I know, right?
signed up to the Apple Chinese communist.
Yeah, I know, right? And it's funny too, because the original iPhone screen was 3.5 inches, if I remember right, and my first Android smartphone was 4 inches. I'm like, well, look at my phone; it's got the bigger screen, and now that screen is considered small and tiny.
Yep, exactly. That was actually a big reason why I picked Google first as well.
Yeah. And
now that is not the case at all. But definitely need to check that out so I can get some recommendations. And so that was Headphones Neil Patel, talking about Moment of Zen and how you can find some Zen. Thank you very much, Neil, for joining me.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me, Rishi.
Okay, that's my chat with Neil Patel, aka Headphones Neil. More Healthy Schmelthy in just a moment. And I shared some tips that keep me calm about meditation. If you need some tips, please feel free to message me. You can find me everywhere. Email, find Rishi B on Twitter, find Rishi B on Instagram, wherever. If you need some help with meditating, I've actually helped a couple of friends of mine out with some simple tips that helped me, and they'll probably help you as well. But thank you very much, Neil, for joining me. Well, let's move on to the last segment. You know, the news these days, it ain't no fun. But hey, it ain't no sweat, because it's good news, everyone.
Good news, everyone!
Good news, everyone. You know, you can find good news, but you have to look for it. You know, when you go into the news, maybe you might be thinking to yourself, man, everything just feels really bad right now. But if you dig through deep enough, if you have your magnifying glass, your news magnifying glass, then you can find little kernels of good news happening out there. For example, the Washington Post, they just shared some news about how doctors are figuring out medical treatments that combat the disease in lieu of a vaccine. For example, they found out that there's drugs, dexamethasone, that helps severe cases. And also, they're finding more evidence for a drug, remdesivir, a name that you might have heard. And so they're compiling evidence for those drugs that they help patients. And they also found that they can marginally improve airflow of patients by having them lie in certain positions. That's enough to significantly improve their outcomes. They're also finding that blood transfusions from recovered patients helps people. So there's little nuggets of good news. But you know what's even more good news? A clip from a recent episode with podcaster, new mother, and fitness aficionado Kristen Ashton. So in this episode, the meat of that was she was sharing tips on staying fit during pandemic. She shared some dietary tips and workouts that we can all do at home. But actually a big part of that episode was also her sharing some struggles of motherhood, both during and before pregnancy. I should say during pregnancy and post-pregnancy. So she shared some of the struggles, but she also shared some of the joys, like in this following clip.
It was about a month ago, and in the mornings, my son is now playing by himself. He'll go for an hour at a time sometimes. So, it's morning. I'm in the kitchen taking care of the dishes and cleaning the kitchen. The sun's coming through the window. He's sticking a toy in his mouth. At least I'm hoping it's a toy.
Right.
Kids, they got to test out stuff. And for the first time, I finally felt like I was back. It was me separate from my son. And in that moment, I realized that when people tell you about how much you're going to love your child, you hear it all the time. It's just such a meaningful thing. You're going to love your children. You won't understand until you have kids. It's not the love, right? Because we've all experienced love. It's more of the fact that kids kind of teach you that love is multiplicative. You don't have a certain amount of love that you dole out, right? To your partner, to your pet, to your plant, to where you live, to your job, that kind of stuff. It grows. Like, it's this amazing thing. You didn't think you had any more left to give, but suddenly there's this whole extra pot to pull from. And it was a beautiful, wonderful moment.
Yeah, that's really cool. I'm really glad that you were able to experience that. That's really cool. Thank you very much for sharing that. So, in a way, all the cliches are true. Then.
Oh yeah. You don't want to admit that a lot of the cliches are true, but they're so true.
Well, hey,
I don't feel bad about it, but
you made the cliches your own. That's what you get. Yeah.
There you go. Yeah, you have your own take on the cliches.
All right, thank you very much, Kristen, for coming on the podcast. If you listener, you want to listen to that episode with Kristen, that was a lot of fun, very informative. That's a couple episodes ago. You can find that at rishibi.com, or you can find that at the podcatcher of your choice. I choose Pocket Casts and Spotify for the most part, but maybe you choose something else. And if you choose something else, then that's the choice for you, as I always say. But you can get more Healthy Schmelthy at rishibi.com. And thank you very much, Kristen, and thank you very much, Neil Patel, for joining me on this episode. And at rishibi.com, you'll find helpful links to stay informed about the pandemic. And you'll also get the show notes for this episode with links to all the articles that we talked about in the health headlines and the et ceteras. And thank you very much, everyone, for listening. And the not the irony, but the just the of courseness, is that a word? The of courseness of two Indian guys getting together on a podcast talking about Zen. That just kind of hit me after we had recorded this. Neil Patel, of his own volition, did the Moment of Zen series. And, after the conversation, I was listening back to it. I was like, wow, this is just exactly what probably a lot of people would think. Two Indian guys getting together, forming a yoga class or something, and doing some stuff about Zen. So anyways, in light of that, how appropriate would it be that we end this just like a yoga session, just like you're back out, there's no pandemic, you went to your yoga class, and so then we pray, we put our hands in the prayer, and then we bring it to
Namaste.
That's right, Neil. We bring it to Namaste.